I was talking to a friend this week, and she had to put me on hold to take an incoming urgent call. I could hear the anxiety in her voice as she says, "Uh-oh, it's the school. Hang on." As she clicked over, I thought, I hope this is not one of those calls from the school principal that every parent dreads, the kind of call that my mom got once. There's been an incident at school, and I have to suspend your child. Sadly, it was. In this case, the elementary-aged child was pulling a prank on a friend, and it went terribly awry, as they often do. It was a case of that pull out the chair from under your buddy as he's sitting down gag that turned into a head contusion complete with gushing blood and all the things that can happen sometimes. When she took me off hold to fill me in on the story, she was rattled and maybe a little embarrassed. She had talked to the principal and then her child, who was totally dismayed and barely discernible through the sobs and the tears. He had not intended for this to happen. To normalize the situation and to calm her nerves, I told her my story of in-school suspension, with all the gory details. And to add to that, I added another story of that time as a teenager when this girl that I liked was at youth group picnic with me, and I compulsively decided to swing her in the hammock, maybe a bit too aggressively. I say a bit because the rope suspending the hammock snapped, and she fell to the ground, hitting her head on a rock, and there was blood everywhere. And I felt terrible and was in tears. Whether we're 6, 10, 46, 66, it seems we all do things from time to time that lead to consequences we didn't intend. I mean, we know that we will be held accountable for our actions, and we also want to do things that are right. But it doesn't seem to stop us from making sometimes compulsive and ill-considered actions. Do you ever wonder why we do this? Have you ever considered how to make sense of these actions? Elliot Aronson has made a whole career of it. Growing up, he was one of those shy, thoughtful, introverted kids that are the inevitable target for bullies. To top it off, he just happened to be Jewish in a small town outside of Boston, one of the few families that lived there, Jewish families. It was the early 1940s. We had yet to experience the horror of the Holocaust, and people were definitely more anti-Semitic even than they are today. And he was forced to walk to Hebrew school by himself. And it was on that journey that he became the weekly target of a neighborhood gang of boys. And he often found himself walking back from Hebrew school with a bloody nose or a split lip. He simply couldn't understand the other boys' anti-Semitic hatred. And he wondered if things would be different if they actually knew him, understood who he was. Although he was deeply considerate and a compassionate child, Elliot reflected that often he found himself acting against his natural disposition and core values. By the time that he was 13, indeed, Elliot was again pulled into another bullying situation. This time, however, he became one of the aggressors, much to his own personal dismay and uncomfortable thoughts. As he wrestled with his decision about what to do, he concluded that although he wished he would have been able to stand up for the victim, he was too afraid of losing his status with the other boys, and again maybe being identified as a target. Because of his fear, he participated in the bullying. Dr. Elliot Aronson has made a whole academic career attempting to understand the notion of cognitive dissonance we feel in these complicated situations, and the stories we tell ourselves to justify our behaviors. We'll get back to that, but first I want to consider the story that Jesus tells us today. when asked by his most outspoken student, Peter, how often he's supposed to forgive his fellow peers, Jesus blows his expectations right out of the water. Not 7 times, 77 times, he says. And just in case you are a bit of an accountant, and maybe you have a spreadsheet at home tallying the times that you've had to forgive me, I know I'm dangerously close with a few of you. Please know that Jesus is adding 7 to Peter's original offering is not meant to be literal. It's a Hebraic poetic form of doubling that's meant to not to convey a literal number, but rather to stand in for an unlimited one. Whew. You can delete the spreadsheet. To illustrate, Jesus tells a rather charged parable. Imagine a world, he says, in which someone who owes an impossibly huge, great debt is living. And scholars tell us that the talent was worth 6,000 denarii, with a denarii being a day's wages. Thus, 10,000 talents would take 200,000 years for a laborer to earn. Again, an impossible number, just like that impossible number of forgiveness. So this man has a debt, and it's canceled, only for him to go out and hold a smaller debt accountable. And the story ends as many of the parables do, with judgment and the weeping and gnashing of teeth, much like how he started the sermon, with a teenager, a child crying over consequences. I wonder if, in hearing this story, you didn't feel like you experienced a bout of whiplash. For this narrative swings back and forth between an extreme mercy and severe judgment. With which character did you identify in the story? If you were like me, you may have found yourself rooting for the slave that owed 10,000 talents before being appalled at the punitive behavior this guy has, grabbing his peer by the throat who owes him a mere 100 denarii. I'm guessing, like me, you embraced the righteous anger of the bystanders who went and told the master what they witnessed. And you probably finished feeling a little justified with the punishment that he experienced. I mean, the guy's a jerk, isn't he? But perhaps you got to thinking, like I did, wait, isn't this story supposed to be about unlimited forgiveness? Which character in this story is supposed to be God? Isn't God supposed to be the master? If that's true, I think I'm in a lot of trouble. I think we all might just be in a whole heap of trouble. Because I know I often hold on to petty grievances when I've been forgiven so much. How are we to make sense of this parable and what it says about God and our human condition? Is God really so judgmental? Does God have a spreadsheet up there keeping track of every mistake, like Alan does of all of our spending? Thank you, Alan. No. What happened to the restorative justice that we heard about in last week's gospel? Perhaps this story is so emotionally complex and jarring because it's trying to lay the groundwork for us to acknowledge a simple reality. Forgiveness is not easy. It comes at a cost, but perhaps not the cost we imagine. The cost is not calculatable. No, the story calls into question the very way that we tell our stories. It makes us pause and consider our practice of justifying ourselves, which is something we all do every day, constantly. Why do we do that? If you've ever been a parent and asked your child, why'd you do that? And they go, I don't know. And it's true. If you ever pause and ask yourself, why'd I do that? You probably can't answer it. And so you make up a story of why we did that. That's what we do. We are storytellers. It is the human condition. We constantly tell stories to make sense of ourselves and our place in the world. And so Jesus, our master storyteller, is inviting us to understand our stories differently. Before we get there, we must embrace the painful fact that in this parable, we, the listeners, well, we have to identify with that slave who was forgiven the great debt and yet held on to the small one. Although it's tempting to cling to that role of the bystander, the role we tell ourselves we live in mostly, we must admit that we too easily fall into the role of the bully, just like Elliot Aronson. That we will regularly and consistently compromise our core values and dispositions naturally, simply to avoid fear, shame, social ostracizing, or losing social status. We're simply put, we're afraid, and so we go with the flow. We try and hide out, play it small. And yet, this parable is about something different. It's easy to read this story as a parable of forgiveness. It's easy to read this parable of forgiveness as a story of greed. But suppose it wasn't greed that prompts our slave to act in the way he does. Suppose, like Walter White, the main character in that famous TV show that I secretly love, Breaking Bad. It's a horrible story that you should never watch. And yet it is so good. Because we understand it. We understand the nature of it. Maybe he's simply providing for his family. He's worried about making sure they have what they need to meet ends meet. I think it's really, this story, a story of cognitive dissonance, just like Breaking Bad, which psychologists define as the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitudinal change, that often causes psychical or physical discomfort. The slave who is forgiven is attempting to hold on to two conflicting realities, and he's forced to tell a story that will integrate both. I wonder what he told himself when he was grabbing his peer by the throat. Maybe he felt endangered, afraid. Maybe he wasn't greedy at all. He tells the story that he deserves to be both forgiven and yet still deserves to recoup what's owed him. Dr. Aronson illustrates this cognitive dissonance by recounting a famous study conducted by his mentor, Leon Festinger, where individuals were given an exceedingly tedious task to do, but were compensated if they could lie to the person in the waiting room and convince them that it was a great experiment, that they should go into the room and just do what the professor told them to do. Each group was given the manual task of turning a knob 1/4 right and then 1/4 left. 1/4 right, 1/4 left for a whole hour. At the conclusion of this task, each group was offered payment if they could convince others in that waiting room that the task was interesting, life-changing, illuminating, that it blew their minds. In one condition, participants were given $1 and another $20. Now, this was the 1970s, so in today's dollars, that's probably like, I don't know, $10,000 and $500. I don't know. The rate of inflation keeps going up. And so after they told the lie and convinced others to join the experiment, they were interviewed again and asked what they thought about the task. Not surprisingly, the individuals that were compensated at that higher level spoke truthfully about how dull and horrible and miserable the task it was. But interestingly, those individuals at the lower compensation, they had a totally different story. Because their payback had been at such a limited level, they needed to make sense of why they told a lie and broke social codes. They needed the task to be more meaningful. And so they concluded that it was pleasurable and even interesting, and that at first maybe it was boring, but it got more interesting as they did it. This study is telling because it demonstrates the human power to tell stories that shape our world. It used to be thought that we humans were rational beings. Now we know that we are rationalizing beings. That is, we tell stories. We tell stories to justify our behavior. For the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. We can make up a story like that of why things are the way they are. We convince ourselves, after violating our values, well, we had to. We were forced. I mean, it wasn't my fault. The guy told me to do it, right? There was no option. I'm sure you know what's going on in this parable because you yourself have done all of that. I think this incongruous action of the forgiven yet unforgiving servant in this parable does make some sense in a culture where reciprocity of obligation structured social norms. In the ancient Near East, there was a particular way of doing things. If someone gave you a benefit, you gave it back to them. He was freed from his debt and free to go about his business, which he did. But Jesus is proposing a different kind of social structure. This servant didn't realize this experience of radical generosity obligates him not to reward the master, but in relationship to all others. You see, he's not looking at things from his master's perspective, but his own. He can't see it until it's far too late, when he's being tortured. He doesn't understand what's now asked of him. What is it that he's now being told to do? To extend grace to others. He's to pay it forward, not back. I have to wonder how different we are from this forgiven yet not forgiving servant. Have you stopped lately to take stock of your life and all the conflicting behaviors that you compulsively and regularly justify? It's okay to drive through that red light if I stop and look and see no one's around. I do that one every day. But is it right? Of course, this understanding of paying it forward, of thinking about not just ourselves, but about the wake we leave in the world and those we affect, this is the foundational principle enshrined in the very prayer that Jesus taught us. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. My friends, today, we have power. We have the ability to change our story. We no longer have to be the victim or the hero of our own narratives, our own stories. Perhaps we can see ourselves from a different perspective, from God's perspective. Perhaps today is the day we acknowledge ourselves as one who's benefited from God's generous mercy. And because of that, we can extend that generous mercy to others with great, lavish generosity. We've been given everything. Why are we holding back? Today's the day. Will you change your story?